Have you ever wondered how ordinary decent people can end up doing terrible things? Maybe you've seen a friend become unrecognizable after joining a certain group, or watched a company's culture transform good employees into unethical actors. Or perhaps you've caught yourself behaving in ways you never thought you would in certain situations. This transformation, from good to evil, isn't just the stuff of religious texts or horror movies. It's a psychological phenomenon so powerful and pervasive that it has its own name: the Lucifer Effect. I first encountered this concept when studying Philip Zimbardo's infamous Stanford Prison Experiment, and it completely changed how I understand human behavior. And let me tell you, it hit way too close to home. I remember being part of a high-pressure sales team right out of college, where I watched myself and my co-workers gradually transform from ethical people into individuals willing to mislead customers just to hit targets. There I was, a person who prided myself on honesty, suddenly finding justifications for half-truths because everyone else was doing it. And that's just how the industry works. Looking back, I barely recognized that version of myself. But hey, let's take a step back. You know those zombie apocalypse movies where perfectly normal people suddenly turn into mindless monsters? Turns out, that's not just Hollywood fantasy, minus the brain-eating part, of course. The Lucifer Effect is basically the real-life, psychological version of that transformation. And trust me, the reality is actually scarier than fiction, because it happens to real people, like me, like you. Let me take you back to the summer of 1971. Zimbardo, a psychology professor at Stanford, converted the basement of the university's psychology building into a mock prison. He recruited 24 young men, all stable, psychologically healthy college students with no criminal history, and randomly assigned them to be either guards or prisoners. The plan was to run the experiment for 2 weeks. It lasted just 6 days before Zimbardo had to shut it down. Why? Because the guards, normal young men who had shown no previous tendencies toward cruelty, quickly began mistreating the prisoners. They forced them to do pointless exercises as punishment. They withheld bathroom privileges. They woke them at odd hours for roll calls. Some guards became creative in their psychological torture, making prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands. And the prisoners? Many broke down emotionally. Others became passively compliant with even the most degrading demands. The roles had become so real that when offered early parole, most prisoners accepted it, even though parole in this context was meaningless. They could have simply said, "This is an experiment, and I withdraw my consent to participate." But caught in their roles, that option became invisible. What's most shocking about this story isn't that it happened. It's that it happened to normal people in less than a week, in a situation everyone knew was artificial. Oh, and get this. The guard behaviors weren't the result of sadistic personalities. Remember, these roles were randomly assigned. The participants could just as easily have been prisoners. Their transformation wasn't about who they were as individuals. It was about the situation they found themselves in. If you're a fan of The Office, think about how quickly Dwight Schrute transforms when he's given even a tiny bit of authority. Remember that fire drill episode where he causes complete chaos? Or when he becomes security threat level Midnight Dwight It's played for laughs, but it's tapping into something very real about how quickly power can change people. Zimbardo himself fell victim to the effect. As the prison superintendent, he became so absorbed in his role that he failed to see the unethical nature of what was happening until his girlfriend, later his wife, visited the experiment and was appalled by what she saw. I've always wondered, what would I have done in that experiment? I'd like to think I would have been the one guard who refused to participate in the cruelty, or the prisoner who maintained perspective. But here's the uncomfortable truth I've had to face. I probably wouldn't have, and neither would most of us. This is the core insight of the Lucifer Effect. Evil isn't just a result of bad apples, people with evil dispositions. It's often the result of bad barrels, corrupting situations, and bad barrel makers, systems that create those situations. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. I would never behave like that. I know who I am. But that's exactly what the guards would have said before the experiment. The uncomfortable truth is that situations are often far more powerful than our perception of our own character. Think about it. Have you ever found yourself behaving differently, depending on who you're with? Maybe you're one person with your family, another with your friends, and yet another at work. We all adapt to our social environments. Often, without realizing it, I still cringe thinking about how I acted at a high school reunion a few years back. Somehow, within 20 minutes of being around my old classmates, I morphed back into my 17-year-old self, complete with the insecurities, the fake laugh, and the desperate need to impress people I hadn't seen or thought about in years. My wife, who came with me, pulled me aside at one point and whispered, "Who are you right now? This isn't you at all." But in that environment, surrounded by those people, it felt almost automatic. This doesn't mean we're all secretly evil, waiting for an opportunity to express our darkness. Rather, it means that under certain conditions, the line between good and evil becomes frighteningly easy to cross. So, what are these conditions? What transforms ordinary people into perpetrators of evil? First, there's the power of roles and uniforms. In the Stanford Experiment, the simple khaki uniforms and mirrored sunglasses gave the guards a sense of anonymity and authority. Their role provided a script for behavior that gradually overrode their personal values. It's like what happens in the Hunger Games. Remember how the regular citizens of the capital, with their wild fashion and colorful wigs, participate in this horrific system where children kill each other for entertainment. The costumes and roles create this alternate reality where normal human empathy gets switched off. That's not just fiction. It's psychological reality. I saw something similar when I visited a corporate office where employees had been complaining about a toxic culture. The moment employees stepped off the elevator, they transformed. Their posture stiffened. Their language became formal and distant. Their normally compassionate personalities were set aside in favor of the perceived requirements of their professional roles. Second, there's the gradual nature of the descent. Evil rarely appears in one giant leap. Instead, there's a foot in the door phenomenon, where small actions pave the way for increasingly problematic ones. A guard might start with a stern tone, move to verbal humiliation, and eventually progress to physical punishment. This gradual progression helps explain why good people can end up doing terrible things without ever feeling like they've crossed a definitive line. Each step is only slightly worse than the last, creating a slippery slope that can lead to extreme behavior. It's like that old story about how to boil a frog. Don't worry, I've never actually tried this. If you throw a frog into boiling water, it'll immediately jump out. But if you put it in cool water and slowly heat it up, the frog supposedly won't notice the gradual change until it's too late. We humans are surprisingly similar. We adapt to gradual shifts in our moral environment without noticing how far we've moved from our original values. I remember interviewing a former employee of a company that had engaged in major financial fraud. She described how it started with aggressive accounting practices that weren't technically illegal, progressed to gray area decisions, and eventually led to outright falsification of numbers. At no point did anyone announce, "Today, we're going to start committing fraud." The progression was so gradual that many involved didn't recognize the severity of what they were doing. Third, there's the diffusion of responsibility. When everyone is partially responsible, no one feels fully responsible. In a group setting, our sense of personal accountability diminishes. "I was just following orders," or "everyone else was doing it," become powerful rationalizations. Here's the wild part. I caught myself using this exact excuse last year when I was part of a committee that made a decision I didn't fully agree with. When a friend later questioned me about it, I heard myself saying, "Well, it wasn't really my decision. It was the committee's." As soon as the words left my mouth, I realized I was diffusing responsibility in exactly the way I teach others to avoid. It was a humbling reminder that none of us is immune to these psychological forces. Fourth, there's dehumanization. It becomes much easier to mistreat others when we stop seeing them as fully human. In the Stanford Experiment, prisoners became known by numbers rather than names. This symbolic dehumanization made it easier for guards to view them as objects rather than people with feelings. This is basically the plot of every dystopian movie ever, right? From The Matrix treating humans as batteries to District 9 with its segregated aliens, pop culture is full of stories about what happens when we stop seeing others as fully human. These aren't just entertaining tales. They're warnings about a psychological mechanism that operates in the real world. We see this mechanism at work in everyday situations too. Think about how easily people dismiss the humanity of those they disagree with politically, or how companies refer to employees as resources or customers as users. This language strips away individuality and makes mistreatment more psychologically accessible. Finally, there's the power of ideology and authority. When we believe we're serving a higher purpose or following legitimate authority, we can justify actions we would otherwise consider wrong. The guards in Zimbardo's experiment believed they were helping with important scientific research. This noble purpose helped them rationalize ignoble actions. I once consulted for an organization where employees were routinely expected to work 80-hour weeks, sacrifice family time, and endure verbal abuse from leaders. Why did they accept this treatment? Because they believed in the organization's mission. They had been convinced that their suffering served a higher purpose. which made it not just acceptable, but somehow virtuous. The Lucifer Effect isn't just about dramatic situations like prison experiments or authoritarian regimes. It operates in our everyday environments, in workplaces, schools, social media platforms, and relationships, any context with power imbalances, ambiguous ethical guidelines, strong group identity, or pressure to conform can activate these mechanisms. Consider how these factors might be operating in your own life. Have you ever done something at work that made you uncomfortable because that's just how things are done here? Changed your behavior or opinions to fit in with a particular group? Followed problematic directives because they came from someone in authority? Found yourself treating certain groups of people differently based on labels or categories? Gradually accepted behaviors that would have shocked you when you first encountered them? If you answered yes to any of these questions, and most of us would, you've experienced milder versions of the same forces that drive the Lucifer effect. I still laugh and cringe thinking about a time I found myself defending a clearly problematic policy at a previous job, simply because I'd been there long enough to normalize it. A new hire looked at me with genuine confusion and asked, "How can you possibly think that's okay?" It was like being splashed with cold water. Suddenly I could see how far I'd drifted from my own values without even noticing. The truly terrifying aspect of Zimbardo's findings isn't that some people are capable of evil. It's that most of us are, under the right conditions. This isn't a comfortable thing to acknowledge. We prefer to believe in the stability of our moral character, that our goodness is intrinsic and unwavering. But there's also something profoundly hopeful in these findings. If situation and system have such power to bring out the worst in us, they also have the power to bring out the best. Just as there's a Lucifer effect, there's also what we might call a heroic effect. The capacity for ordinary people to resist negative influences and act with courage and compassion. Zimbardo himself has spent recent years studying heroism as the antidote to evil. He's found that heroes aren't extraordinary people. They're ordinary people who make extraordinary choices in challenging circumstances. Think of it like the Lord of the Rings. The ring corrupts almost everyone who comes near it. That's the Lucifer effect in action. But then, there's Sam, the ordinary hobbit who resists its power, not because he's superhuman, but because of his simple values and clarity about what matters. That's the heroic effect. So how do we resist the Lucifer effect in our own lives? How do we ensure we're not unwittingly pulled into harmful behaviors by situational forces? First, we must be aware that these forces exist. Simply knowing about the Lucifer effect makes you less vulnerable to it. Awareness creates a crucial moment of pause, a space between stimulus and response where you can choose consciously rather than react automatically. I've made this a personal practice. Whenever I find myself in a new environment or role, I take a minute to ask myself, how might this situation influence my behavior in ways I wouldn't choose? Just that simple question helps me maintain some perspective when powerful social forces start to work their magic. Second, we need to practice questioning authority and consensus. This doesn't mean becoming paranoid or rebellious for its own sake. It means developing the habit of asking, "Is this right?" even when everyone around you seems to accept it. I think of a whistleblower I interviewed who prevented a major public health disaster. When asked how she found the courage to speak up when others remained silent, she said, "I just kept asking myself, if my children were affected by this decision, would I think it was acceptable?" The answer was clearly no, so I knew I had to act. Third, we need to maintain our sense of personal responsibility even in situations where it would be easy to diffuse or displace it. The guards who behaved better in the Stanford experiment were those who continued to see themselves as individually accountable for their actions, regardless of their role or the behavior of others. Fourth, we must be vigilant about language and practices that dehumanize others. When we notice ourselves or our organizations using labels that reduce people to categories, or when we see barriers being created between groups, these are warning signs that the mechanisms of the Lucifer effect may be activating. I had a wake-up call about this a few years ago when I caught myself referring to homeless people in my neighborhood as the homeless, rather than people experiencing homelessness. It seems like a small linguistic difference, but it reflects a profound shift in perspective, from seeing people primarily through the lens of a single characteristic to recognizing their full humanity. These small language choices matter more than we realize. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to create environments that bring out the best rather than the worst in people. This means designing systems, organizations, and relationships with an awareness of how easily situations can corrupt. Leaders have a special responsibility here. By shaping organizational culture, establishing norms, and modeling behavior, they become barrel makers who can either facilitate or prevent the Lucifer effect in their domains. I worked with a CEO who transformed his company's culture by making one simple change. He established that anyone in the organization could question decisions without fear of repercussion. This created a check against the gradual normalization of unethical behavior. When someone said, "I'm not comfortable with this," everyone, including leadership, was expected to stop and reconsider. The implications of the Lucifer effect extend far beyond psychology. They touch on philosophy, ethics, politics, law, and even theology. If situations have such power to shape behavior, what does this mean for our concepts of free will, personal responsibility, and moral character? These are complex questions without easy answers. But acknowledging the power of situational influence doesn't mean abandoning the idea of personal responsibility. Rather, it means expanding our understanding of what moral responsibility entails. Being a good person isn't just about having good intentions or virtuous character. It's also about actively creating and choosing situations that bring out our best selves rather than our worst. It's about recognizing the forces that can lead us astray and consciously resisting them. And perhaps most importantly, it's about approaching others with compassion rather than judgment, recognizing that if we had walked in their shoes, faced their situations, and been shaped by their systems, we might have made similar choices. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does give us a more complete understanding of how such behavior emerges, which is essential if we want to prevent it, rather than merely condemn it after the fact. I used to be much quicker to judge people who did things I considered wrong or weak. I would never do that, I think to myself. But studying the Lucifer effect has been incredibly humbling. Now, when I see someone behaving badly, I still hold them accountable. But I also ask myself, under what circumstances might I have done the same thing? That question has made me both more compassionate and more vigilant about the situations I put myself in. The Lucifer effect reminds us of our capacity for darkness. But in doing so, it also illuminates a path toward light. A path that begins with awareness, continues through conscious choice, and leads to the creation of environments where goodness can flourish. So the next time you find yourself in a situation that brings out behavior you're not proud of, or when you're tempted to judge others harshly for their actions, remember the lessons of Zimbardo's experiment. Ask yourself, what barrel am I in? Who made this barrel? And most importantly, how can I ensure that I'm acting from my values rather than merely responding to my situation? Because the line between good and evil doesn't run between us and them. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn wisely observed, it runs through every human heart. Understanding the Lucifer effect helps us guard that line more effectively. In ourselves, in our relationships, and in our world. And that awareness might just be the difference between being the villain in someone else's story or the hero in your own.